thank you so much for having me. Thank you for sticking around. It's quite late in the day now. Thank you for having me at CNEG 2 over 4. Has anyone else read it like that all day? Because I can't unsee it. So yeah, whenever I speak at zeroheight conferences, I seem to be stuck at the beginning or the end of the day. And I think that's on the basis that I once gave a talk that was sort of funny. So I think the idea is that I'll do something kind of uplifting and get everyone in the mood for the social. The bad news is this talk is not that. The good news is that if you are someone that likes an alcoholic drink, you will need one after this. So, so for those of you that don't know me, my name's Amy, and I am, as Michelle said, I'm a content design and design systems consultant based here in the UK. I have worked both in-house and also as a consultant through my own company, Frankly. And over the last 8 years or so, I've been lucky enough to work with a few different organisations on their design systems, including the UK government, BT, which also includes EE and PlusNet, for Springer Nature, the Wellcome Trust, Camden Council, Wayflyer, Backmarket, and I'm now working with the BBC. Hi, BBC. So yeah, in that time, I've seen pretty significant changes in the way that we approach design systems. And today I'm going to be talking about one of those changes in particular that concerns me. Before I do get started, I just want to give a quick content warning, because to tell the story that I'm going to be telling today, I am going to be talking about a few slightly difficult topics, including domestic abuse and people who are struggling with suicidal thoughts and feelings. Told you it was a cheerful one. So if these issues are difficult for you to hear about for any reason, then please just do look after yourself. Feel free to take an extended coffee or toilet break, or just dissociate into your phone, or even have a nap. I can't really see you, so I wouldn't know. But for those of you that do want to stick around, there's not really any getting away from the fact that this talk is just kind of a bummer. So I was thinking about ways to try and make it a little bit more palatable, given that it is the last talk of the day and I don't want to completely depress everyone before we head to Vodka Revs or wherever we're going after this. And so with that in mind, I've decided to try and provide a bit of light relief through this talk, in the form of something that over the past month or so has brought me such pure, unadulterated joy that I can't quite put it into words, and that is Moodang. So hands up if you have encountered Moodang already. Okay, most of you. For those of you that haven't, first of all, where have you been? And second of all, allow me to introduce you to the creature who has single-handedly kept me from clinical depression. Now, Moodang, which roughly translates to bouncy pig, I believe, or elastic pork, depending on the source, she's a baby pygmy hippopotamus, and she was born on the 10th of July in Thailand in a zoo. And she's quickly taken the internet by storm with her playful nature and her refusal to comply with her zookeeper's attempts to bathe her or feed her or handle her or really get her to do anything. She's an angel and an icon, and I'm quite in love with her. And by the end of this, I'm sure you will be too. So given that, and given the serious and slightly depressing nature of this talk, I have included some carefully timed Moodang breaks throughout, just to give us some much-needed respite. But yeah, let's crack on with the misery. So, this bit's all right. So I'll take you back in time to 2017. I had just joined the government digital service as a content designer. Joined this lovely team. At least one of you is in the audience today. And we had started working together on what would eventually become the GovUK design system. And this was the first time that I'd worked on design systems or even heard of design systems. And my experience there won me over so much that I've stayed working in this field ever since for my sins. And I remember what it was that excited me about it back then. So, for example, we talked about the possibility of using the design system to make services more accessible for UK citizens. We talked about making forms more inclusive so that fewer people would face barriers in their day-to-day lives. And we also even talked about influencing policy changes so that people who were historically at the margins of society would be recognised and centred in government service design. So it's really exciting stuff. We talked about using the design system as a way of creating impactful social changes and solving really meaningful problems. And this is what design systems represented to me back then. This is the kind of opportunities that I saw. But in the time that I've been working in this field, my experience of it has kind of changed, and I see that change reflected in the industry as a whole. So I used to come to events like this and have conversation with colleagues and read articles written about design systems. And I used to see us asking these really big, difficult existential questions. Things like, what is the purpose of design systems? Or where does the scope of our work begin and end? Or which problems are we responsible for and which ones are for someone else to solve? But nowadays, I see us pretty much just asking one much more specific question, which is how can we create UI more efficiently? So efficiency has become our collective's North Star, right? Today we talk about measuring our success by cost savings or the number of components that we've produced or using AI to automate our documentation. Please don't do that. Creating the perfect token architecture that allows our organizations to redesign their digital products at the flip of a switch. And we follow these kind of template approaches for creating our systems, from the structure of individual components to the taxonomy of our systems as a whole, and for our processes for things like providing support to our users or enabling contribution. And it feels to me, at least, as though we've kind of declared ourselves done with exploring the problem space, and we've become focused exclusively on this one objective, which is how can we be more efficient? And efficiency in and of itself isn't a bad thing, right? Wanting to save money by avoiding repetitive work makes perfect sense. But the limitation that comes with efficiency and optimizing for efficiency is that all it really does is help us to do more of what we're already doing more quickly and at a greater scale. And the underlying assumption with that is that what we're doing today is working. Because reinventing the wheel is obviously a bad idea, unless you design the wheel badly in the first place. And when I look around me today at the state of our digital products, I see these kind of glaring failures. We've heard about a few of them today. So I see accessibility issues, I see exclusionary design, and I see shortcomings in our products and our services that negatively impact profits and, more importantly, people. And all of this leads me to ask, is efficiency really the best thing to be aiming for? Or what if the thing we should actually be seeking is change? So this is where I think we can start to take inspiration from a source that actually predates digital design systems. God, I'm glad I put that phrase in. So this book, Christopher Alexander's A Pattern Language, is often talked about as one of the most important precursors to digital design systems as we see them today. And if you haven't read the book, it presents basically a series of problems relating to architecture and town planning and proposes patterns to help address those problems. So each pattern is introduced with a problem statement like this one. They can be quite broad. So this one is individuals have no effective voice in any community of more than 5,000 to 10,000 persons. The problem statements are then expanded upon and followed up by a proposal for how to tackle them. And when I returned to this book, when I was researching this talk, it struck me how much we have let patterns fall by the wayside in our design systems. So in fact, in last year's How We Document survey, which is an annual survey run by documentation platform zeroheight, just 38% of respondents said that they're currently documenting design patterns as part of their design systems. But when I think about how we might go about repositioning design systems as more than just vehicles for improving efficiency, but as actual real agents for change, I think that patterns are actually a key part of the solution. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to share 3 examples with you, 3 example problems. And the first one is very specific and relates to a clearly identifiable scenario and group of people. And the others are increasingly kind of broader and more general and require multifaceted solutions to tackle them. And in each example, I'm going to talk about ways that I think design patterns can help to solve the problems that I've outlined and create profound, meaningful change. So as I said, to begin with, I'm going to start with a highly specific problem. People experiencing domestic abuse face risk when they seek information or use online services relating to their situation. According to the National Centre for Domestic Violence, 1 in 5 adults will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. Every day, some of the people that make up that statistic seek guidance on their situation and in some cases support to leave. But even the act of seeking help carries a risk. So if their perpetrator catches them, then there's a risk that they will react badly and make things worse for the person they're abusing. And if we were just thinking about design systems purely in terms of providing these kind of context-agnostic components and reusable things, then we could easily conclude that a problem like this is just out of scope. It's not really ours to solve. But what happens if a design system team thinks outside of their role of just making things more efficient and consistent and turns their attention to a complex social problem like this? Well, last year, that's what the GovUK design system did. So they worked in collaboration with the Ministry of Justice, the Department for Work and Pensions, and the Scottish Government to try and help solve this problem. Since gov.uk provides information on identifying domestic abuse, on legal rights and things like where to go for support, they wanted to try and minimise the risk to users that might access that information. And this work resulted on a tangible level in 2 new additions to the GovUK design system. So the first one was an exit this page button, which when it's activated, takes the user away from the page that they're on and to a different website. And an exit this page quickly design pattern, which explains how to use the button together with information for users on how the button works and its privacy and security features. And I want to talk about this work because I think it's a really good example of the impact that's possible when we think beyond just efficiency and we work to deliver meaningful change that really puts people at its heart. One thing that's really clear from reading the documentation and the blog post about this work was the effort the team went to understand the problem space that they were facing. So given the complicated and obviously sensitive nature of the problem, the team's designers and researchers had to be really careful about researching and testing any components and patterns that they designed. And in particular, they obviously had to consider their duty of care to research participants and avoid re-traumatizing them in the process of gathering important insights. So to help with this, the team enlisted the help of an organisation called the Hinburn and Ribble Valley Domestic Abuse Moving On team, which is an organisation that supports people who've had lived experience of domestic abuse. And with their support, the team were able to recruit psychologically resilient participants who could take part in the research and also provide necessary support to those people during sessions. One of the main findings from the research that they did was that they needed to give users a clear understanding of how the exit this page function worked, whilst also trying to keep the button and any supporting content as discreet as possible for obvious reasons. And so in a blog post about the work, the team explains that they decided that the component and pattern needed to actually encompass a way to inform users about online safety and privacy. And as such, they included guidance for service teams to add safety content as part of Exit This Page. So including this content as part of the design system updates means that service teams that use the Exit This Page component and pattern can present information consistently with confidence that this has been validated by user research. Another important challenge for the team designing the Exit This Page interaction was how to make it as accessible as possible for groups of disabled people, for people using assistive technology, and for people with maybe poorer internet connections. So for users who are not able to click the button, either because they can't see it or because maybe they have problems with motor control, the button can be activated by pressing Shift 3 times. The component also includes a page overlay, which makes the web page go blank as soon as a user activates the button. And what this does is it hides the content between the user activating the component and the new page loading. So that helps to protect people who are maybe on slower internet connections. And there's a really interesting post about this work on the GovUK Design Notes blog, which I really recommend reading if you want to learn more about it than I've been able to share today. But for now, I just want to kind of draw attention to the thing that strikes me most about this work, which is that neither the route to producing it nor the outcomes that it achieved were particularly efficient on the face of it. So the team really went over and above when they made sure that they kind of designed and validated the component responsibly, and they worked with external experts to design trauma-informed research. The documentation they produce is noticeably longer than we would typically aim for with component and pattern guidance. And in terms of the implementation, it's clear that the component is quite complex, with lots of behind-the-scenes functionality that ensures that it's as accessible as possible for disabled people and those using assistive technology. And I think it would be so easy for us to deem this work out of scope for a design system team and to just provide a button that can be adapted to the products and services that need to use it in this particular way. But by engaging with that complexity, the team has achieved ultimately something much more valuable than greater efficiency for designers and developers. What they've done instead is made a dangerous situation faced by far too many people a little bit safer. So we've covered some important, I hope you'll agree, but quite heavy stuff over the past few minutes, which means that it's now time for our first Mudeng break. Yeah, I knew that would wake you up. So this is Mudeng making her Vogue debut just last week. She's pictured here with her mother, Jonah, 25 years old. And Vogue describes Mudeng as an icon for our adult times, which is a really euphemistic term for the horror that we're currently living through. And the girl we all wish we could be, and I couldn't agree more. So let's all take a moment to enjoy this touching moment between mother and daughter. Are you sufficiently uplifted? Yeah, well, really the best I can do. So I'm going to move on now to talk about a second problem, one that's a little bit less specific, but that touches multiple parts of a design system, which is people who cannot correctly identify themselves in our forms will stop using our services or provide inaccurate information. Now, since pretty much every single digital service or product includes at least one form, you would think that by now we, as an industry, would have it down to a fine art. But my interactions online remind me on almost a daily basis that this isn't the case. So let's start where we normally do with design systems and look at some form components. And I'm going to start with a really simple example, the humble text input. A box with a border for users to write into and a label telling them what information should go there. Once we've defined the style for our text inputs and focus and error states, we're pretty much done, right? The nuts and bolts of this component are actually quite hard to get wrong because we've got HTML specs telling us how this component should be structured, and we've got plenty of good examples across the web to base our design on. But where things seem to fall down is where we start to apply some actual context to this component and use it to collect some actual information. Imagine that. So let's think about one example. Let's think about how we ask people for their names. And I've chosen this field to start with because when I think about how a lack of diversity and inclusion in our industry as a whole really shows up in our work, this is one of the first things I think about. And that's because a lot of us working in this space have some unintentionally, but very real, narrow and biased ideas about names. So this is a list that I've shared in many talks before of 40 false beliefs about names put together by Patrick McKenzie. And it's really worth a read if you haven't seen it before. There's a lot of assumptions in there that are very enlightening, and I know that I believed when I first read it. And when these false assumptions inform our design systems and our patterns for asking people for their name, we start to prevent people from being able to accurately identify themselves to us. So this is an example by Stephanie Walter, whose name includes an accent over the first E. And the validation here has been set in such a way that it's impossible for her to enter the correct spelling of her name. This example comes from Pandu Supriyono, and it's common for Indonesians to have a single name, which means that there's no first name, last name distinction on his passport. But when he registered with the Dutch Corona Checker app, it's registered his last name as null. And this is another example from Mikhail Echevarri, whose last name was registered as invalid in this form. And this is something you see all the time. So there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of this happening all over the internet. We create these kind of arbitrary rules around what constitutes a real name, and then when people fail to satisfy those rules, we tell them your name isn't valid. Let's look at another component now. Let's look at one that's a little bit more contentious this time. So, a drop-down. Now, despite its prevalence on the web, the usability issues with drop-downs are well documented. In fact, all the way back in 2014, Alice Bartlett, who was a front-end developer working at the Government Digital Service at the time, gave a whole talk describing the problems that she had observed users facing when trying to use a drop-down. And even though a decade has passed between then and now, most of the issues that she mentions persist today. But that isn't the particular beef that I'm going to discuss with drop-downs today. Instead, I'm going to talk about one of its applications that has been particularly frustrating for me recently. What is your relationship status? So, for a bit of context, I separated from my husband back in January 2023, and since then, and maybe because of that, I have noticed myself bombarded with questions about my marital status from everybody from the company who leases me my car to the place where I book my manicures. And even if I'm to set aside my frustration at being asked what is now actually quite a painful question by organisations who really don't need to know my relationship status to deliver me the service that they're offering, I can't really overlook the options that I'm given to answer with. Single, cohabiting, married, divorced, widowed. Now, I wouldn't describe myself as married anymore, probably, but I'm not divorced yet either. I'm not cohabiting, and I'm also not single. And the last time I checked, my husband was alive and well, so I'm also not widowed. So where do I go in this list? Maybe a more accurate set of options to describe my situation might be consciously uncoupling, playing Celine Dion's Think Twice on repeat until my neighbour asks if I'm okay, traversing the human hellscape that is modern dating apps, getting a regrettable tattoo from a man in Paris who I think was high when he did it. I'll show you in the pub later, and if anyone can guess accurately what it is, I will buy you a drink. Learning to love myself again, or at least trying to. And this is probably the one and only time you'll ever hear these words come out of my mouth, but maybe Facebook got it right with their option to tell people it's complicated, because life is complicated, right? And when forms don't make space for that, it's not just impractical, it's painful. So let's look at one more component now. Radios. This is a set of radios. And again, it's a simple component with an HTML element for us to work from and plenty of good examples to follow. But once again, often the problems with this component are not with the design of the component itself, but with the way that we use it. So let's look at an example of that. What is your gender? And what we see over and over again are these same buckets. Right, we have male, male first, of course, female, other. And it's that other that I find so problematic here. So just a quick count through of Wikipedia's page on gender currently reveals 101 genders. MedicineNet lists 72, and another site that I looked at lists 112. And the exact number isn't really what's important here, but what is important is that that's a lot of people that we're not allowing to identify themselves correctly when we just give them these buckets of male, female, other. And aside from the fact that we often don't really need to ask about people's gender, and beside the fact that asking it like this means that we're reinforcing a gender binary, there is a real human impact to this. You know, it hurts every time somebody is confronted with this and they don't fit into one of those two buckets. So I've only talked about 3 common form questions here, but in reality, forms on the web and therefore our design systems deal with much more. And when we don't design for this full human spectrum of identities and characteristics and circumstances and experiences that our design systems need to serve, we're not just excluding people and hurting feelings, we are erasing them. We're either losing them as customers altogether, or we're failing to accurately represent them in our products and our services. So where do design systems come in? Well, as in the case of the GovUK design system team faced with the Exit This Page challenge, it seems to me that we have a choice. We can draw a line around our work and design components without context and just rely on and trust products and service teams to make their own choices about how to design specific user-facing forms and interactions. Or we can choose to take some accountability for the eventual outcomes of our system, and we can go further in trying to create a kinder and more inclusive web. So we can provide patterns for asking specific questions in a way that caters to a realistically broad set of parameters, and we can work with teams in our organisation to educate them on inclusive design as necessary. And we can have opinions about how the building blocks that we create are used in practice and work to ensure more human-centred outcomes. And for me personally, I got into this space to improve user experiences, right? The clue's in the name, that's what drew me to this kind of field, and on that basis I would choose the second of these options every time. And speaking of aspirations, that leads me nicely onto our second scheduled Moodeng break. Now, a fairly short-lived but now quite firmly held life goal of mine is to one day meet Moodeng. Unfortunately, though, given that I hate flying and she's in Thailand and as far as I know can't yet use Zoom, this is looking quite unlikely. But luckily, oh, this is going to get so weird, through the magic of AI, I was able to get some insight into what that moment might look like for me. So, oh, yeah. So, this is how Midjourney imagines that moment might go for me and Moodeng. I am happy to see that she seems to be as delighted to meet me as I am to see her. I'm less clear on why I've been represented as a strange Tim Burton-esque woman-child and dressed in this kind of medieval come ancient Egyptian outfit. But yeah, this is how Midjourney understood the assignment, and who am I to question that? Yeah, so let's move on to the final problem that I'm going to present you with today. Now, exclusionary content design causes harm to people and costs organisations money. How, you ask? Well, so I'm going to open here by sharing another personal story. Isn't it weird? I'm the third person now to... Oh, you haven't actually seen one of the talks, but spoiler, one of the talks tomorrow also includes a broken heart emoji, which makes me the third person I know of at this conference to include a broken heart emoji on one of their slides. I don't know what that says about our collective well-being, but something we should take note of. Anyway, as I mentioned before, in January last year, I separated from my husband, who I had been with for a long time, for 12 years. And I started looking for short-term rental options to move into whilst we figured out what we should do next. And without really giving it much thought, I turned to Airbnb and I found a nearby flat. And I remember, sorry, I have a hair on my wrist, which is really distracting me. It's gone now. I remember that time quite clearly as one of the most painful things that I've ever been through. I remember looking around at the boxes around me with a lump in my throat and seeing piles of my clothes and books and cafetiere we bought together and wedding photos on the bookshelf that I wasn't going to be taking with me. And there were a lot of things I needed in that moment there. I needed a hug. Maybe I needed some reassurance, or to know one way or the other whether I was ever going to be coming back. What I didn't need, and I cannot say this emphatically enough, was a series of auto-generated emails designed clearly for somebody going on holiday. Pack your bags. It's almost time for your trip. Welcome to Hertfordshire. So I can laugh about it now, but at the time, each one of those emails and those exclamation marks was an absurd misjudgment of my situation that might have been funny then if it wasn't so awful. Airbnb's design system is famously strict. They have tight rules around component and pattern usage, which everyone is expected to follow unless they have a very good reason not to. And I've no doubt that that's efficient, right? Cracking down on deviation from the system is a really good way to ensure almost no duplication of effort. And I'll give them this. The emails themselves were nicely formatted and appeared to embody house style, so much appreciated. And again, it would be easy to say that none of what happened there was the fault of the design system team. I imagine they probably have no involvement in customer communications and a separate team handles that. But what if they did? Right, what if Airbnb's design system created a pattern for asking users about the reason for their trip? Or what if design systems like Airbnb's educated other teams within the organisation about designing for stress cases? What if they produced content patterns, like we heard about earlier, for writing communications for people who are travelling because something bad has happened, like they've separated from their husband, or they're going to a funeral, or they're visiting a sick relative? Airbnb is the market-leading option for short-term rental, and these scenarios I'm describing are not unusual. They happen all the time. And on that depressing note, I believe it's about time for our final mooding break. Someone went, yes, yes, very much time for a bit more mooding. Now, this piece by Dazed suggests that mooding has become a symbol of righteous anger against capitalism, claiming that when mooding screams, she screams for us all. I do wonder at this stage whether we might be projecting a little bit too much onto a 2-month-old infant hippo. Nevertheless, though, let's enjoy this delightful photograph of her protesting her impending bath. Has that cheered you all up? Oh, good. Okay, that's better. So, back to Airbnb. I probably won't use Airbnb again unless I'm actually booking a holiday. I was upset by the insensitivity of those messages, and I'm making a choice now to take my business elsewhere. But what happens when the organisation in question is not a business and there's no elsewhere to go? Back in 2021, I was working on a local NHS project aimed at children and young people and helping them to find support for their mental health. The service worked by asking users a series of questions about what they were struggling with and what kind of help they were looking for. Then, based on their answers, it would give them a list of organisations that might be able to help them. One of the questions that we had to ask as part of the service was if the user was feeling suicidal. And if they answered yes, they were taken out of the form to a page advising them to call 999. So they were unable to continue using the support finder and were instead directed to emergency services. And when I first encountered this interaction, it seemed to me to be quite reasonable and responsible, as it might do to you now. So obviously, if someone is in that severe of a mental health crisis, then of course they should be directed to someone who can respond with an appropriate level of urgency. But suicidality is complicated. To validate the work we were doing, we ran some research with children and young people who had either past or present experience of mental health issues. And one participant encountered this question about feeling suicidal, and on seeing the page telling them to call 999, they sighed in frustration. And when we asked them about their reaction, they said, "This is what always happens. I am chronically depressed. I feel suicidal most of the time. I'm not going to end my life. I've just learned to live with the feelings and to manage them. But I can't use anything like this because it always just tells me to call an ambulance." Now, it would have been easy enough to see this as just an unfortunate but unavoidable outcome of this person's circumstances. We had to ask the question to be compliant with health and safety, and we had to direct users that we identified as being in crisis to the emergency services. But something about that didn't feel right. And so we talked to the Samaritans. If you haven't heard of the Samaritans, they are a wonderful UK-based charity who offer a free listening service to people who are struggling with their mental health and people who are feeling suicidal. And they explained to us that within their service, they differentiate between people who are feeling suicidal or having suicidal thoughts and those who are actively planning to end their lives. And based on that, they advised us to split the question into two parts. So, are you planning to seriously hurt yourself or end your life? Or are you struggling with suicidal thoughts and feelings? Users who said they were struggling with suicidal thoughts and feelings but were not planning to end their life would be shown a message advising them that if they felt they were in danger, then they should call 999. But they were given a choice to continue using the support finder if they wanted to. So by engaging with the complexity of this issue, we made a small but powerful change that means that people like that participant we spoke to can now access mental health support even if they're struggling with chronic thoughts of suicide. Secondarily, this also reduces the need for costly emergency service call-outs on the already stretched NHS when they're not strictly necessary. Now, these aren't the kind of patterns that design systems typically encompass or document, but my question is, why shouldn't they be? Exclusionary content deters or completely prevents people from using our services and our products, which not only does harm to them, but also costs our organisations money. As design system teams, we have a unique opportunity to help course correct these kinds of decisions, to surface stress cases and patterns for addressing them, and to educate people in our organisations about the importance of inclusive content. And as people working on design systems, we're often told that our job is to optimize for efficiency above all else, to just kind of speed up and scale other people's design choices and just multiply them and multiply what we already have. But I would really like us to go further. I would like us to ask ourselves what more we can do from where we're sitting to create more meaningful change in the world. And I think design patterns are a really good place to start. There is a quote in Christopher Alexander's A Pattern Language, which I talked about at the start, that says, when you build a thing, you cannot merely build that thing in isolation, but you must also repair the larger world around it and within it, so that the larger world at that one place becomes more coherent and more whole. And this is what I want to leave you with today. Design systems touch so much more than we see day to day, and that gives us all power. And as we know, with great power comes great responsibility. So use it wisely. Thank you.